Mr. Kraisak, as a former chairman of the Thai Senate Foreign Relations Committee, how would you characterize post-coup US-Thai relations?
Since the 1990s to the turn of the century, there's been 3 coups. Let's measure by these standards. The 1991 coup, for instance, the U.S. did a very similar thing to the 2014, and that is cutting off military aid, delaying or dismissing the annual military, what we call exercise called Cobra Gold, which began since the 1980s. That actually means the cancellation of all temporary cessation of scholarship for Thai students studying in the Virginia Military Institute or the West Point military schools. That is not a great deal because the collaboration between Thailand and the United States goes way back to the post-war years, in which Thailand became one of the foremost ally to the U.S. in the Vietnam War, providing perhaps the biggest onslaught of the United States, the American military juggernaut, to bring war to 3 countries, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. The cause of the war still there, but nevertheless we have reached a new era by which is more complicated. At one point, when the Soviet Union and China was still considered socialist, centralized authoritarian countries, you've had a very I would say a liberal approach. When a military coup happens, they demand that one return to democracy as soon as possible and establish normal relations, and on those conditions normal relations will be resumed. In the case of 2014 coup, the same demands were delivered by the Secretary of State, Mr. Kerry. I have a feeling that this is not always the case. The Americans do not apply this case to the case of Burma or Egypt or elsewhere for that matter, when a democracy is toppled by a military coup. But in the case of Thailand, there has been since the year 2002-2003 a very close relations between elected government, the majority government under Mr. Choonhavan with Washington, namely the neoliberal, or I would say neo-conservative group and corporates of America, and the government then of Mr. Thaksin in year 2003 sent military consignment to support the invasion of Iraq. So you have a very close relation between an elected government and the United States. Therefore, the reaction was a bit strong against the coup, and it was felt quite so in Bangkok. But this, having said that, the very coup, the reason for the coup, we should say, has to be said. That Thailand has been through a period of, I would say, the past 4 or 5 years, almost an unworkable democracy, by which the opposition against the elected government would be so strong that it required repressions and almost drastic security measures in which lives were lost. For instance, in the past 2 years and a half, what happened was that the government supported by Mr. Thaksin Shinawat, being his sister as Prime Minister, Madame Yingluck, Miss Yingluck Shinawat, who ruled Thailand for 2 years and a half, was could be classified as one of the first, I would say, unworkable and almost a failed state under democracy, in which the parliament was not functioning at all. Dismissal of sessions in parliament reflect a growing authoritarian and tyrannical aspect of the government, to the extent that questions and answers were not carried out properly. In fact, they were not carried out at all, to the extent that the majority rule uses its power over and above the law, over and above the constitution. That scared a lot of people, that their voices were not being heard, and that checks and balances were being override. And however, the most scariest thing for the Thai people, I believe, was the fact that the government is engaged on an open corruption. And above that, they were on a rampage of borrowing huge loans for projects which were non-transparent and which were dismissed by specialists in several institutions and agencies as undoable and as wasteful and even dangerous for the economy. I'm talking about a 2.2 trillion baht loan on mega projects, which comprise of Rapid 7 projects for high-speed trains, for 20 or so dams or floodways, which will affect millions and millions of people. And these projects, in fact, caused opposition in the countryside. Over 9 provinces form an alliance, and we saw 50,000 at one point people in the provinces protesting the dams in Ratchaburi, in Kanchanaburi, and elsewhere. And most of the protests were against the not the project itself, but the non-transparent process of the project, in which people were not consulted according to the Constitution, the first, in fact, clause of the Constitution, which allows the freedom of speech on this matter, and and the heart, the spirit of the Constitution was ignored. But most of all, what the people were worried about was that, in a final sense, on a final, I would say, decision of the government to come out with a amnesty law, brought out a outburst of not this time, not fear, but of anger. Anger over the fact that the amnesty law First, in the manner that it was passed at 4 o'clock in the morning. It was passed under conditions of cheating, voting illegally. It was passed under the condition that the bill was not discussed at all. It was going to thrust through in a manner that you would see in authoritarian countries and not in a democracy. So what followed was that we had over 1 million people protest in the first few days. The end of last year, is 2013, until just a few months ago, before the coup, we've had about 7 months of protests, huge protests in the streets of Bangkok. The government responded with its own actions, both illegal and mass protests of its own. We saw clashes between the anti-government protesters and the pro-government protesters, or the red shirts. And the protests were not at all conducted in a civilized manner. There were violent clashes, weapons were drawn, shots fired, and it got so bad that war weaponries were brought into a protest side, particularly on the government side. The opposition responded almost in kind. They had armed guards to protect the relatively peaceful demonstrations in the tens of thousands on a daily basis. But things got very violent when a typical government response was to employ gangs and groups of attackers which use war weaponries to fire and throw hand grenades, injuring more than 700 people. And all of them, most of them, in fact, except for the 2 officers, were the opposition side. In the end, it ended up with something like 25 dead. And this include about 4 children, 2 years old, 3 years old, women, and old people. And aged people were affected by this confrontation. That alone was very unsettling, and it was so scary, in fact, for the Bangkok people, that when the coup was announced, people were relieved in a way that their lives and their security of going to work, to and fro, to shopping or wherever, of necessities, were now much more peaceful.
Is there any such a thing like a justifiable coup d'etat? And what do you think about the latest coup in Thailand? Can it be justified?
Well, in the Western sense, of course, it's not justifiable. But in Thailand, we're used to the military coming to, if you like, to fix things when confrontation on both sides is uncontrollable. But sometimes, like the coup in 1991, there was absolutely no need for a coup, except for the fact that the government was accused of corruption, huge corruption. But in this case, the scale of corruption was so big that I think people were relieved that the government was not going to put everybody into debt. For instance, the rice scheme, which became probably one of the biggest corruption cases of epic proportion, will cost now the Thai people something in the vicinity of 400 to 500 billion baht in debt. And increasingly in the post-coup investigation, we're finding out that tens of thousands of tons of rice are missing or are replaced by rice of very low quality from neighboring countries instead of the good quality which they were supposedly buying. Therefore, the loss went, the huge loss of the billions probably most likely went into the pockets of politicians and ministers and officers involved in this rice scheme. It was a turning point in the demonstration, the protests against the government, in which tens of thousands of farmers that were not paid for the rice joined the demonstration over and the fact that remains a mystery. I don't know why it was never covered by Western press, the Western media on this matter. In fact, the BBC, CNN never covered this. Neither The Guardian or one of the most progressive the press ignored this. And another thing that they ignored was that 47 labor unions has from the beginning sided with the opposition, and they held their ground at the Ministry of Interior. These are militant trade unions, transport and the waterworks, electricity, you name it. Most of the major unions sided with opposition because of the corruption that has ensued since year 2002 up to today. And they identify the corruption with the elected government, and particularly elected government led by Mr. Thaksin Shinawatra, with his, I would say, appointed and if you like, representatives over 4 governments in all. Now, this could be concluded quite easily that democracy has not worked in favor of the people at this time now. And I think in all democracies, we should have periods of reviews, periods of, I would say, inside out looking, periods of reforms to make the system more responsive to people's needs. And that's what the people are demanding now in Thailand. Of course, there will be those now reduced to hardcore red shirts, supporters of the government, supporter of the USThai party, for instance, would argue that the system they want to establish was a so-called people's democracy. And people's democracy is fairly defined in general terms as something like democracy being written only in the parliament by the majority of the USThai themselves, you see. But not a democracy which constitutes checks and balances like we have today. Now we have all sorts of anti-corruption, independent organizations like the Human Rights Commission, the court, special court, Supreme Court for politicians. We have anti-laundering commission. We have the what we call the internal scrutiny agencies, in which it was argued that these were established by the coup in year 2006. So they should be get rid of. But most of the people who are learned, who are fed up with corruption, want to keep these agencies. And that was a big conflict between, I would say, the opposition and the government that was overthrown, the USThai. That was one of the main issues, and people were literally scared, and then eventually the fear turned into anger, and now into, I would say, after the coup, relief in a way, that the military managed to stop all the corruption, all the major projects are under review, except for some that the military has started, which already there is an undercurrent of opposition to it, which because of the lack of freedom